All right, Sarah, good morning. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
So great to be here.
Yes, I'm excited. This is your second time on the show,
Hmm.
and a big change since
Hmm.
we last met.
Hmm.
You talked a little bit about it on the first episode,
Hmm.
but you've written the book.
Yes,
Yes,
yes. The book is in the world.
yes,
It's a big
and
thing.
yeah, the place we make, um, and it's about uh, uncovering the roots of racism locally
Hmm.
here in Oregon City, where you
Hmm.
live. But it's been a journey into the past, but it's surprising in that there's a connection to the roots of your own family.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So the book, and it tells two stories. It tells the story of Jacob Vanderpool, who was a saloon and boarding house operator in Oregon City in 1851. And he became the only person legally exiled from the state of Oregon under the state's anti-Black exclusion laws. So the book tells that story, and not just Jacob Vanderpool, but also the people around him who worked either explicitly or sort of with complicity to make that exile happen. And then when I found out that some of those people who pushed him out were my own family members, then it became a personal story. So the book goes back and forth between 1851 and my own life and my own heart, and trying to look for how has that history showed up in me. So
Yes,
yeah.
yeah. The can you say a little bit about Oregon City
Yeah.
and its importance in here in Oregon?
Yes. So Oregon City, for those who aren't familiar, was the end of the Oregon Trail. It was where the people came, when they put all their stuff in a covered wagon and walked across the continent. They had to come to Oregon City in order to register for their free land. So in the 1840s and 50s, almost everybody who came west came to Oregon City first. It was the first incorporated city west of the Rocky Mountains, and a whole bunch of firsts: the first Protestant church west of the Rocky Mountains, the first bookstore west of the Rocky Mountains, the first college west of the Rocky Mountains. I mean, a lot of things were started here in Oregon City.
Yes. The one of my favorite parts of reading was seeing the family names, the
Mm,
founder of Oregon City, like John McLaughlin,
hmm.
McLaughlin Boulevard, just
Hmm. Hmm.
seeing the names of the native tribes, and
Hmm.
it's uh, the La Tourette Falls,
Hmm. Hmm.
your family.
Hmm.
Um, it just uh, gave it more of a sense of place and a
Hmm.
connection to the past.
Yeah. And that was what was so fascinating for me in doing the research, was all these places that were kind of meaningless to me when I first came here. The names on the roads and the different things, they sort of came alive, and realizing, like, oh, it's named that for a person who did a thing, and who were those people and what were the things that they did.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, uh, can you say a little bit about early on what hooked you uh, and fascinated you about Jacob Vanderpool? Because as I'm reading, it's like you had like you were like a bulldog, like you had to like find and understand and learn about
Yeah.
him.
Yeah. Yeah. So it actually began as an assignment in my MFA program. Um, my professor told me to go and write an essay about something that's researched. So it was totally wide open assignment, could have been anything in the world. And I remember sitting down that day after I had that conversation with her and making a list of, like, all the things in the world that I might be interested in researching. And it was a very broad list. It was, like, there were oceans, and there was like um the science of how our eyes work, and just like whatever I thought might be interesting. And Oregon's history of anti-Black exclusion made the list because I had recently had a conversation with my brother, um, I had just mentioned to him, I had recently moved back to Oregon after being away for most of my life. And I had mentioned to my brother, there's a lot of white people here. Like, that's kind of weird. And after having lived in New Jersey and Chicago and just places that were different.
Right.
And my brother said, Sarah, didn't you know there's a history of anti-Black exclusion laws in Oregon? And I'm like, no, I had no idea. So that made the list of possible things to research. And I remember sitting down with my computer and just Googling, like, okay, what might I write for this essay? And the name Jacob Vanderpool jumped out at me. I think because it felt like maybe it was a small enough story that I could get my hands around. I feel like when we look at racism, sometimes it feels so big and so like just the whole world. And to think like, okay, here's one guy who was impacted by this. Could I find out more? But yes, it became bigger than just that one essay. I mean, I did some research, I wrote the essay, and then the essay ended up to be 40 pages long. And of course, I couldn't publish it anywhere because nobody publishes 40-page essays, right? And so I remember giving it to a friend, and I said, can you help me figure out what to cut so I can make this short enough that, I could get it in a magazine or something? And she read it, and she sat down with me in a coffee shop in Selwood, and she said, Sarah, I don't think this is an essay. I think this is a book. I don't think you should cut anything. I think you should make it longer. So then I went out and found more things. But the why of like what kept me going, you're right. I did feel a little bit like a bulldog. And I think that probably gets back to an experience I talk about in the book when I was 20 and I went to Malawi in East Africa on mission trip is one word you could use for it. It was also I was a student. I mean, I knew I wasn't going there to like change the world. I was going there to learn. But the first thing I learned about the first morning I was there, I walked to the window and looked out, and there was a group of Black men sitting under the window where I'd been sleeping. And my first thought was, this is a dangerous place. And then my second thought was, you only think that because they're Black. And I really hadn't known that lie that Black men are dangerous, that's, everywhere in our society. I hadn't realized that it had implanted itself into my heart until I went to Malawi. And so I think that was part of my motivation in working on this story, was knowing that some of the lies that were out there in our society had attached themselves, unbeknownst to me, into my own heart and mind. And so it was partly a sense of like, if I work hard enough on this, can I don't know, it wasn't exactly atonement, but it was a feeling of like, I have to figure this out for me.
Yeah, I definitely picked up on that. Like you're trying to figure it out, but you also were trying to right some wrongs.
Yeah.
There was you were not comfortable with how things are.
Yeah.
And you spent a lot of this writing this in the last few years, and with where racial dissension, unrest, injustice is like just regularly in the news. Like we can't escape being aware of it or confronting it. Well, I should say we're aware of it, but we choose to engage with it. And you chose to engage with it, even though it's hard.
Well, interestingly, in May 2020, I had been trying, I had written this whole other book about my own personal trauma, and maybe we talked about that last time I was on the show. I don't remember. But so I'd written that other book and it didn't sell. And in May 2020, I was on the phone with a friend and she said, Sarah, I think it's time for you to start thinking about what your next book is going to be about. And I said, I think it has something to do with racism. And I had already written some of the Jacob Vanderpool essay, but, set it aside. So those thoughts had already been there. And I was thinking maybe this could become a book. And then the next week, George Floyd was murdered.
Mm.
And I kind of wanted to take my words back. Like, oh my goodness, I can't speak into this. Like, suddenly the conversation was, there just felt like there were so many experts and there were so many opinions. And I just thought, I actually don't know what to say. But I
Right.
decided at that time, okay, I'm just going to listen. I'm going to watch. I'm going to show up to this conversation in the ways that I can. And I'm going to pray and see what happens. And so it was kind of just following along that eventually led to this book coming out.
Yeah. I do remember like maybe 3 years ago, 2 years ago, where it almost seemed like in 1 month or two,
Mm-hmm.
boom, there was a
Mm-hmm.
half a dozen racism books,
Mm-hmm.
and for white fragility books that
Mm-hmm.
we
Mm-hmm.
had, or you're supposed to
Yeah.
read.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
oh man.
Yeah.
And one of the messages was, um, we need to stop putting white authors and voices
Mm-hmm.
up front. We need to needs to be pulled back and put
Mm-hmm.
people of color and hear from them. So
Mm-hmm.
can you, how have you done with wrestling with that? And
Yeah.
have you gotten pushback? Like,
Yeah.
who are you to like tell this story?
Yes. I mean, first of all, from, trying to sell the book to different publishers, and several publishers said, no, we're not going to publish this because we're not publishing white people talking about race right now,
Hmm.
which is I mean, it's a fair critique, right? And I want there to be room for all the people of color who have something to say
Hmm.
to be able to say it. But and so yeah, and I had a lot of fear about, like, would people say, she's not staying in her own lane, or who is she to take, pick up this story about this Black man, and why are you the one who's doing this?
Hmm.
But I just kept feeling, as I was watching that conversation unfold, like, this can't just be a one-sided conversation. Like, we can't just have people of color saying, this is how you've wronged us,
Hmm.
and white people just saying nothing. Right? I just felt like somebody needs to step up and say, yes, we have, and I'm sorry. And so that was what I tried to say. And then also, owning it as my family's story. And I think that so often the way we talk about racism, we talk about the people who had bad things happen to them, and we don't talk about the people who did the bad things. And so just being willing to say, like, it was my family members, and let's look at who they were and what they did and why.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
The I liked how you described how it's easy to talk about racism or racist people as like other people,
Mm-hmm.
like those awful people
Mm-hmm.
on
Mm-hmm.
TV doing awful things, and
Yeah.
um, but but slowly having that realization, or maybe maybe suddenly in
Yeah.
moments,
Yeah.
that's like, oh, it's in me.
Mm-hmm.
um it, in the book you said you needed to begin examining the white supremacy in my own heart.
Mm-hmm.
um and uh and you wrote that you step into the confessional.
Mm-hmm.
I make my confession to Jesus, but I leave the door ajar so you can overhear. And you know that was um very helpful to me, because you
Mm-hmm.
wrote about uh, the the silence of good people,
Mm-hmm.
the
Yeah.
complicity,
Yeah.
um, is just as destructive and hurtful, and it perpetuates the problem
Mm-hmm.
when community and the men that you describe,
Yeah.
uh, there's the active role in having Jacob Vanderpool expelled, but
Mhm.
it's a good people, a pastor,
Mhm.
um, or neighbors or communities not saying anything,
Yeah.
not being brave enough to say anything, or not knowing what to say,
Right.
not knowing what to do. Like,
Yeah.
what do we do with this?
Yeah.
And I hear that a lot, is whether it's the idea of reparations,
Mhm.
or the reality of, I live in Oregon, I live in Portland,
Mhm.
one of
Mhm.
the whitest cities in America. I don't I don't know any people of color.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, can you say a little bit about the challenges of that question? So what do I do?
Yeah. Yeah.
What do I do with this?
Yes. I mean, that is our question, right? That was my question. Um, and so what I tried to show through this story, or the path that God has led me on, is I think one that others can follow it, and which is to bring this question to a very local level, right? And just to ask, what is the story of my place, my group, my neighborhood, my family? What are the wrongs that have happened here? Who has been harmed here? And it may take a little digging, to find the old bylaws and read them, or to find the deed, or to look in the newspaper archives, or whatever it is. But once we uncover what's happened here, and then connect the dots with that history and our own hearts, whatever's in our own hearts, then I think the steps will become more clear, because it's not about some big nebulous thing. It's about something that happened here. Like, I think about the town of Waldport. I don't know if you're familiar with Waldport. It's on the coast, and it's just a little
It's a
humble
little.
little town. Yes.
We used to go to a little home. Well, one of our
Mm,
friends would rent it. It's outside of Walport every
yeah.
year for like nine
Yeah.
years. Yeah,
Okay, you
yeah,
know it. So it's just this humble little town. Most people are driving up and down 101. They're going somewhere else, right?
yeah,
They're just
yeah. It's
driving
real
through.
quick. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's small.
just and you're gone. But the town of Waldport recently learned, well, they knew that they had a road called Darky Creek Road. And they recently, it was uncovered what the history was behind that road name, that there was a man who lived down that road who was African American, and his name was Lewis Southworth, and um, he was a fiddle player, and he wanted to come to the local Baptist church, and they said, no, you can't come to this church. And so he lived down that road, and that was why it was called that. And so over 100 years later, this little humble town decides, we're going to change our road name, and we're going to raise money, and we're going to commission a sculpture of this man. And so if you go to Waldport today, you can see this life-size statue of Lewis Southworth playing the fiddle. And that's such a local thing, right? Like, nobody else could do that. Only the people in Waldport could resurrect that story and put up that statue. And I just think there are stories all over this country that are just waiting to be uncovered. And I don't know if everybody needs to put up a statue, but there's something to be done in each local community to name the harm that's happened in the past, and to turn a corner on it in some way. So I think the future of this question is local.
Yeah. A lot of your book, you talk about the your local history in
Mhm.
Oregon City.
Yeah.
It's not just in the state of Oregon,
Mhm.
but it was for you. It was literally like out your front door,
Yeah.
just walking down to the river
Yeah.
that your kids would swim in.
Yeah.
Uh, the with As you've been writing the book and I can see that you're making connections with people of color.
Mhm.
I wanted to ask you about that that dynamic or thing that comes up
Mm, mm-hmm,
where you you you're eager to listen and talk,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
but folks are like decline or pass.
mm,
Um,
yeah.
and I'm asking a little selfishly, because the church that Julie and I go to,
Mm,
it's pretty diverse.
mm,
Lots of African American
mm-hmm,
leaders. Our pastor Mike Dean, he's black,
mm, mm,
um, and it's we're doing church, but we're coming out of the pandemic. It almost feels like we're a new church, like
mm,
a church plant, even though it's
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
uh, been in existence for maybe 7, 8 years.
mm,
And and I think we do our gatherings well, but we're still trying to form deep relationships. Like we're still trying
mm,
to gather, gather a small group
mm-hmm,
ministry.
yeah.
Um, and I imagine that race and our stories are going to come up
Mm,
if we're going to
mm-hmm,
do it,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
and I'm hoping
yeah,
that we do it well.
yeah,
So
yeah,
so long setup to the question is, I'm just curious, like what's been helpful for you.
yeah, yeah. Well, I did feel as I started writing the book, like one of the biggest things that I was grieving was that I felt this sort of racialized loneliness. Like here I am in this mostly white town. My kids go to mostly white schools. My husband's the pastor of a mostly white church. And it was like, how do I break out of this? How do I like change this without, I don't want to tokenize people. I don't want to
Right.
hey, will you be my one person of color friend, um and so I did feel stuck. And then also in, writing this book and sort of naming, confessing my own internalized implicit biases, I was really afraid that in doing that, that people of color would read the book and say, like, well, we don't want anything to do with you. Like if you've had that thought ever in your life, like, I mean, I was just afraid of being, canceled or whatever. Um, but what I've discovered is that the writing the book has opened so many doors, and doors to real relationships. Like I was just recently sitting down with a woman who had invited me to come and speak, and we ended up sitting in her place of business, and she's a Black woman, and she just ended up kind of pouring out like everything that she's carried and all the racism that's come to her in just going about her day-to-day life in Oregon. And it was just such a privilege to sit there with her and to hold that with her. Um, and so, but I think that in order to be ready to show up like that for people in my community with empathy for their stories, I had to first do all the work of examining what was in my own heart. So I feel a little bit like the book tells the story of the work I had to do before I could start doing the work, And now that the book is out in the world and I have been started to be invited to, this or that thing, I feel like I wouldn't have been ready to step into those relationships unless I'd first done the work of examining my own heart.
Yes.
So,
Yeah. You didn't set out to be an expert on racism,
no.
right? Um, but you're just like genuinely telling this story,
Yeah.
the unfolding
Mhm.
investigation,
Mhm. Yeah.
and just more and more realizations that it. You said like history, it isn't. We think of history as like discrete events,
Mhm.
but this is your family history.
Yeah.
It and it was kind of awkward and cringy at times
Mhm.
when you would like meet, whether it's with people you love in your church community, or
Mhm.
even your
Mhm.
own
Mhm.
cousins,
Mhm.
like where they they're just in a different place
Yeah. Yeah.
with you, with
Yeah.
interacting with this. Um, the what what would you say has been like the most difficult part of writing this or looking at this?
I mean, the couple things. I mean, one of the difficult pieces, one of the emotionally difficult pieces is just to allow myself to come face to face with depth and the breadth of the horror. Like to think about my ancestors who enslaved other people, and to really allow myself to sit with that and to experience and to imagine my way in as best as I could to what does that really mean? What are we talking about when we say millions of people were enslaved in this country? And I think it's a lot of my life I would sort of hold that at arm's length, like, well, good thing that's not me now. But it was emotionally difficult work to enter into that. So that was one difficult thing. And then the other difficult piece was just the fear of getting it wrong, of saying the wrong thing, of doing the wrong thing, of, having the wrong tone. And yeah, God was so good to me. Just like very gently kind of nudge me along one step at a time. And to say, and I say in the introduction, I couldn't have written this without knowing that I was loved. And so to know the love of God and in a very personal and real way, God would give me what I needed to take the next steps in the midst of the fear and the grief. So,
Yeah. They loved and forgiven. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so important.
Yeah.
One of the things that you said was confronting racism is emotionally challenging work. It's easier to hold it at arm's length, to pretend it's someone else's problem. Repeated shock is easier than sustained sorrow. And you talked about Jacob Vanderpool and a competitor bringing the charge against him, and the judge, like the unfairness of the judge living in the competitor's hotel. It just like it's just so unfair. Right? But one of the stories that really impacted me was the Native women being beaten by settlers, and it going to trial. I was surprised that it would even go to trial.
Yeah.
But then it was such a farce, they couldn't even testify or admit their testimony. So it was just a complete sham.
Yeah.
But not just like the unfairness and injustice, but just the violence.
Yeah.
And just the terror and fear that you're just worthless, and you could just be beaten and suffer, and there's just nothing you can do about it. Complete helplessness and powerlessness.
Yeah.
Just
Totally.
those stories.
And I think that we as a society, particularly we white people, don't want to look at those stories because we really want to hold in our minds this idea that we're the good guys, that we beat the British in the Revolutionary War, and we did the right thing in the Civil War, and we've always done the right thing, yay! And And I think that it's so hard to look at those things in history that are just not right, to acknowledge them and to acknowledge that it was, in many cases, people in power. It wasn't just a one-off, like random bad person who did this. It was like the laws of the land that said this is the way it will be. And, then you look at states that are today now saying, like, we're not going to tell these stories. We don't want to teach this history. And there's still, I think, so much shame that we can't even look at the history.
Yeah.
But what would it look like for us as a society to say, okay, we're going to look. We're going to look at what really happened, and we're not going to let fear or shame stand in the way of, just being honest about what happened.
Yeah. As a marriage counselor, I talked to couples about Gottman's four horsemen of the apocalypse in relationship. And three of them are defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. And so when I'm reading these conversations that you have sometimes, these challenging conversations, I'm like, oh yeah, you're being stonewalled there. They just can't take it in. And I think shame is part of it. But also, like, or people were even angry at you talking about it in church. This is a big thing. Being stuck at home, doing the social media thing during the pandemic, with all the things the last 3 years. So just seeing how divisive that oh, you're being divisive. Don't bring it up. Don't make me uncomfortable. But I think a little bit of it is, well, that's in the past. How can I bear any responsibility or even make it better? Like, it just is a helpless, hopeless feeling that I'm not a bad person. I didn't own slaves. Those types of attitudes.
Right.
But compassion and humility is so important, because if we have contempt for people who say those types of things, nothing gets better.
Right.
We just stay stuck and entrenched in our positions.
Right.
We have no influence if we just write people off as racist or ignorant or whatever, or hateful.
And we do the very thing to them that we're blaming them for doing to others, right? When we say, like, oh, those terrible people who have those horrible beliefs, like, we keep ourselves apart. And so, it is a big leap of compassion to say, why does that person have that shame? Why does that person feel the need to stonewall this? Or why does that person feel afraid to bring this up? And how can we move forward? It's a big question.
Yeah. I liked reading about Ezra Smith. Is it the last
Ezra Fisher.
Ezra Fisher.
Ezra, am I saying no? Ezra, why am I forgetting? You said Smith and then it.
I threw you off.
You threw me off.
Isn't
it? Let's look it up.
Oh, Fisher. It is. I wrote it.
It is Fisher. Okay, good. Yeah, Ezra Fisher.
Ezra Fisher. Founded the Baptist Church. It's a Baptist college. I was just imagining just the influence on Christians in Oregon City and in the area. I'm sure is a huge impact and teaching. And so, and you reading his letters and his sermons, and you said, like, he has a heart for God. Like, you felt like he was genuinely a man of God, sincere. And yet he was a product of his time. He was very influenced by the culture. And so it's important to address the social dynamics, like
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
place we make,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that what we make, what we actively teach and act out and do, but we also make by what we allow,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, or what we stand by and don't
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
are silent about. Um, and yeah, it's the you tell the story of some people who are uh, uh, doing good work
Mm.
in this world. Can you tell listeners a little bit about some of the people that you've met?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So one of the people I talk about in the book is Taylor Stewart. He's young. I don't know how old he is, but he's definitely younger than me. He's still full of like energy and idealism. And he's a Black man who's from Oregon. And when he visited the South, the American South, and saw the lynching museum, he thought, I want to do something like that back home in Oregon. And so he started a um, a nonprofit called Oregon Remembrance Project. And his work is to go and help communities remember and repair different acts of racial injustice that have happened here in Oregon. So he began with the lynching of Alonzo Tucker in Coos Bay in 1902, and he worked with the Coos Bay community, and they wrote a memorial. They put it on a plaque. And then he's working with the town of Grants Pass, which was a sundown town, and they are kind of envisioning what it would look like to be a sunrise town. And he also wants to work with Oregon City on the story of Jacob Vanderpool. And what was so cool about writing this book was I didn't know when I started where it was going to end up. And so even as I'm writing the book, I'm making these connections, and I get this email passed on to me from a friend from Taylor Stewart who he wants to connect with somebody in Oregon City who's working on Jacob Vanderpool. And then I was downtown having dinner with some friends, and I had just recently discovered through the help of Oregon Black Pioneers, which is another nonprofit, where Jacob Vanderpool's actual location was. And I said to my friends, let's go walk over and see where it was. And it was behind the fence of the property that's owned by the descendants of the Clackamas tribe who used to live there, hundreds of years before. And I was able to get a business card from the guard who was just sitting there by the fence. And I was able to get in touch with the tribe, which we had been trying
oh wow,
for years
yeah,
to
you didn't
email
put
and
that in the
call.
book.
And
Yeah,
no,
that's
because it
amazing.
happened after it had already been written and been sent to
Yeah,
the publisher. But
wow, wow.
yeah, so I was able to get in touch with the tribe, and then I was able to have a Zoom meeting with the tribal leaders and Taylor from Oregon Remembrance Project and Zachary Stocks of Oregon Black Pioneers, and like just see them getting together in a digital room, meeting each other for the first time. And the tribe is like excited about putting a memorial to Vanderpool when they redevelop this property. And it's like these things are happening now. Like we're adding on to these stories right now. And it was
Yes,
so cool to get to see that happen.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
One of the coolest moments at your book book signing
Mm,
at Powell's,
mm-hmm,
Grace, my daughter, and I, we went, and uh, 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 we cope with being people of color, I think, a little bit. My daughter
mm,
and I were similar
mm,
with our sense of humor, with humor,
mm-hmm.
like
Yeah.
awkwardness, or we're like,
Yeah. Yeah.
oh yay, I'm glad we're here to represent BIPOC people. Um, and but one of the great, well, as we're listening, and you guys are just
Yeah.
talking, Taylor's
Mm-hmm.
there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, I could feel a little bit of some folks just kind of shrinking, like
Mm,
like ah. like the weight of like,
Mm,
we're terrible.
mm,
We're
mm,
white.
mm,
Sarah's telling us we're racist,
mm,
and you know, this is
mm,
what, and you know, we're bad. I don't.
mm, mm.
But then when your friend, the mayor of Oregon City,
Yeah.
stands up,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's like, wait, she's black. Oregon
Yeah.
City is a
Yeah.
racist
Yeah.
town,
Yeah.
racist origins, but they have an
Yeah.
African American mayor now,
Yeah.
and it
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
uh, like like Grace and I we were just loving it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was a moment of just seeing, oh, there's progress,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and part of me is like, yes, there's progress, but don't like let that reality
Right.
let you off the hook.
Right.
Like, oh, okay, I guess we're fine now.
We're done. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, but I have to try not to be cynical.
Mm-hmm.
I have to have
Yeah.
gratitude for the progress,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like
Yeah.
having a black mayor or black president, um,
Yeah.
it 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 doesn't erase the injustice.
Mm-hmm.
Like you know, we haven't talked about it, but I learned so much about just like the idea of like what has been stolen
Mm.
and the financial
Mm-hmm.
implications
Yeah.
of racism.
Yeah.
Um, you know, it doesn't erase all that, but just having gratitude
Mm-hmm.
for the
Mm-hmm.
steps.
Mm-hmm.
And I think just you can't do everything, but if you're willing
Yeah.
and just showing up and making connections,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it is healing.
Yeah.
You know, you talked about an author who, you know, something had happened in the national news and her pastor didn't say anything about it,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and just the silence and not acknowledging it
Mm-hmm.
that was painful.
Mm-hmm.
That was
Yeah.
lonely.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm so glad you're writing. You've written this book, and you're doing what you're doing. Um, at your book signing, I learned about like what a sundown town is,
Mm.
because I kind of heard about it,
Mm-hmm.
and there was like a couple of months ago there was a song in the national uh country song, and that was like
Mm.
controversial,
Mm.
and it was
Mm-hmm.
kind of
Mm-hmm.
alluding, like, are you saying, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
is this
Mm-hmm.
alluding to like sundown?
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, what does this mean? And you
Yeah.
know, my thing of like, I'm too busy, or I can't
Mm-hmm.
have the mental
Mm.
emotional space to
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
address
Yeah.
like dig into it.
Yeah.
But then you explained, and it became personal. This it's just shocking that in Grants Pass, I think it was like a sundown town until like early 70s. I think
Mm.
it was like 72.
Yeah.
And my in-laws and my wife, they moved there from Oregon in like about 1974, 75.
Mm.
Um, and I just learned, you know, I just learned today that my wife, in the entire time she was growing up there, there had only been one black family in town,
Wow.
and
Wow.
she had told me that before, and I thought, oh, that I assumed that they were there for like a year or two, but she
Mm.
said no, they were just there for like a month. And when she told me that, I was like, that it's not on the books, the black exclusion,
Yeah.
but people are still being expelled,
Yeah.
or people are still being prevented, whether it's like emotional and relational
Mm-hmm.
safety.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
People of color coming to Oregon,
Yeah.
or not feeling welcomed or
Yeah.
comfortable here.
Yeah.
It's just like, oh wow.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's not the distant past.
No, it's not. I mean,
Mm.
just last night, I was sitting at my son's soccer practice talking to one of his friends who's biracial, and his friend was telling me about the racist bullying that he's enduring, like right now.
Mm.
I mean, right now. And it just hit me again, like this is it's history, it's the past, and it's so present and it's happening on, on my watch. So this book and me stepping into this conversation is just trying to figure out, like, okay, how do I respond? How do I help shape my community so that these kinds of things don't have to happen anymore?
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
So, what's next for you?
Well, so I don't live in Oregon City. I live just outside Oregon City in Gladstone.
Oh, okay.
So here in Gladstone, I recently learned that there's a property just down the street. I don't know if you're familiar. If you ever come off the Gladstone, the DMV exit, there's a Seventh-day Adventist property there. There's a
Oh, yeah.
it says Christian books and vegetarian foods. So I just recently learned that on that property, in 1922, 2,000 people came out to watch as 110 people got initiated into the KKK right there. And so I just had this idea. I met with the mayor of Gladstone yesterday, and I'm meeting with the Seventh-day Adventists in a couple weeks to ask them. They haven't said yes yet, but I just thought, what if we could have an event on that same property where we invite people to come out, not for the purpose of initiating people into the KKK, but for the purpose of saying, that's not who we are anymore. And we want to be a different kind of community going forward. So I don't know, it's still in the planning stages. I've had various different people say they want to, help be part of it. I'm really hoping that the Seventh-day Adventists will say, yes, we can host it. Because I was talking to a friend about this. I don't know if you're familiar with Jonathan Tremaine Thomas. He founded Civil Righteousness, which is a really cool organization. So I was asking him, is this performative? Like, is it performative to just like come together and have some kind of ceremony? Because I think as white people are really afraid of, like, we don't want to be performative. And JT's Black, and he said, Sarah, every culture has ceremony and ritual. Like, it's valuable just to come together and speak the words. This is not who we want to be as a community. So that's my idea. We'll see what happens, but
yes,
yeah,
this is who we want to be. You said one of the most important prayers or desires is for us to heal as a nation. And so, this is all a part of it, Sarah.
Yeah.
So
it is.
Keep going. Thank you.
Thank you.
For what you've done so far.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right. We'll put in the show notes ways for people to connect with you and hopefully partner with you with that work.
That would be great.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good to see you again. Thanks for coming on.
Good to see you too. Thanks so much.